Hey friends, welcome. My name is Shayda Campbell, and this is video 2 in our 4-part series, Joyful Watercolor, Finding Your Style. Video 2 is filling our sketchbook, watercolor pattern play, and mark making. We're gonna have a lot of fun with this one. Just like we got creative and very childlike in the first video with those doodles, we're gonna do it again, but this time we're really getting back to basics with mark making. We're gonna see what all those different brushes can do. Not what they should do, but what they do for you. And we're going to also play with watercolor techniques. What does wet into wet look like? What does a bloom look like? And how do we create them? By having fun with all these brushes and techniques, we're going to set you up for success later on when you do want to paint something a little more complex. So let's get started. First up, supplies. You can also reference your worksheet for the supply list. I'm working in this visual journal from Strathmore. It's a watercolor sketch pad with 140-pound cold-pressed paper. I also have the Aquafine travel set from Daler-Rowney. These are really nice pan or disc watercolors. I have 2 glasses of clean water, paper towel for blotting my brushes, and then speaking of brushes, we are using all of them. I have a number of Princeton brush sets, and we talked about that in more detail in video 1. And I tend to use my round and long round brushes for a lot of the painting that I do. But in this video, we're going to discuss techniques and we're going to do a bunch of pattern painting. And I think it is the perfect opportunity to use some of the brushes that we don't reach for quite as often. So grab your flat wash brush and your angle shaders, the oval wash brush, as well as those round and long round brushes. We're using all of them. Now we're going to do an exercise, just a little sketchbook page where we work out and try some different watercolor techniques together. So the first one we're going to do is wet into wet. And I'm just taking a small brush and some clean water and I'm putting water right onto the paper. I've gotten my paper what we would call puddle wet. Then I'm grabbing a little bit of blue paint. You could use any color and we're going to release the pigment into the wet area. And you can see I just put a little splotch down and it moves. It has this wonderful fluid movement and everything kind of bleeds and blends. And that is the beauty of wet into wet watercolor. Now the pigment will not go anywhere that is not wet, so you don't have to worry about that. You're just going to get this soft, wonderful, blendy look. Okay, next up, we're going to try wet into wet color. So I've got a little bit of green there. Again, you can use any colors for this, but I'm going to lay down a blue swatch of paint. I should have switched to a larger brush for this, but that's okay. And I'm just making a messy little square of nice wet blue pigment. And then I'll wash my brush, and with a clean brush, I pick up the green paint, and we're going to release a little green into our blue. So this is wet into wet color. It's the same sort of idea where the pigment is going to blend and move really beautifully, has this nice soft look, and the pigment will not go anywhere that is not wet. So it's never going to move onto the dry paper. All right, we've done a couple variations on wet into wet. Let's try wet on dry together. I'm taking my flat wash brush and I'm going to just lay down a nice splotch of color. I'm using green, but you can use any color. And the wash brush is really nice for doing a large, smooth area of color. Then I will take my smaller round brush and I'm going to mix like a really nice dark green. So I've got some ultramarine blue here. I'm going to mix that into the green a little bit, give me this nice dark, rich, cool green. And then I'll take that pigment in my small round brush and we'll come over here to our sketchbook and we'll make sure that is in fact totally dry. You want it to be completely dry. And we're just going to paint on top of it. So wet into wet and wet on dry, it's really what it sounds like. It's wet paint into wet paint or wet water. Wet water, okay, that's a little redundant. Or it's wet paint on top of dry paint. And when you are using a wet on dry technique, you're going to get a beautiful amount of precision. You can see that here as I paint these tiny little leaves and berries. Nothing is moving. There's no movement of the paint. So I'm able to layer, to add detail, to add shading. I can be very precise, and I don't have to worry about the paint taking off and going anywhere as it does when the page is wet. Next up, let's create a bloom or a couple blooms. This is a really fun watercolor technique. So I'm using my flat wash brush to lay down a nice splotch of color, and then while that blue is still wet, I take a clean, wet brush. I've got nice clean water in my brush here, and we are going to release water into the wet pigment that's on the paper. And you can see the pigment is moving. That blue is starting to move outward. And we're getting almost this snowflake or crystal look. I love blooms. You might use them when painting water or a sky or clouds. And as the paint moves out, you can take a dry brush and kind of pick up a little bit and make that bloom even more striking. And that technique actually is called lifting. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. So I'm using lifting as kind of part of my bloom. Let's move right into lifting. I'm using my mop brush now to give me a nice color splotch. And then while that color is still damp, lightly wet, we take a clean, damp brush or even a dry brush, and we can just press those bristles to the pigment, and it's going to lift, and we can almost erase. So lifting is great for mistakes, but it's also a wonderful technique for painting clouds or adding highlights to anything that you might paint. Okay, at this point we've used a bunch of our different brushes. For our final technique, I think I'll grab the number 8 round, but really any brush will do for the technique of dry brushing. So we'll pick up some paint, and then we're going to blot the brush on the paper towel to get rid of any excess wetness or moisture. And we are going to kind of just run the brush across the paper, attempting to maybe pick up a little bit of the texture and just make this messy, dry sort of brush stroke. Dry brushing is wonderful for painting trees or adding shading or texture. Really understanding all of these techniques will allow you to get quite creative, not only with what you paint, but how you paint. So we've covered wet into wet, wet color into color, wet on dry, blooms, lifting, and dry brushing. Creating a little sketchbook practice piece like this is great fun, and it's also great for, just as I said, understanding how to use watercolor so you can be more creative with how you actually paint. This video lesson is all about learning the watercolor techniques and learning and practicing with the different watercolor brushes. So I think a wonderful way to kind of work on both of those things is to paint some patterns. Pattern painting is a lot of fun. It gets you away from objective painting where you're trying to paint a thing, and frankly, that makes it really approachable. It's very childlike. You can just have fun. You don't have to worry about, did I paint this right? Did I do good? Good in air quotes. You can release yourself from all that stress and just think about color, think about watercolor techniques, try out some brushes that you otherwise might not. And so that's exactly what you see me doing here. I'm just moving quickly through this first one. I'm using kind of a primary color palette of red, yellow, blue, except I'm doing magenta, yellow, blue, and I'm just painting circles. That's it. That's all, circles. I am allowing the circles to touch ever so slightly, and so in that way, I'm kind of practicing my wet into wet watercolor. It's not quite wet into wet. We're not releasing color into color, but what I'm practicing here is how does the color blend when it just hits side by side. So some of these circles, they've got a big, huge burst of magenta into yellow. In other areas, you'll notice a soft blend of yellow into blue. So this is all about timing, and that's what we're really practicing here is our timing. When we place color beside color, how long do we have to wait or not wait? If we want a really wild blend, not so long. If we want that softer blend, we have to wait a little bit so that the paint is not puddle wet, it's just lightly wet. Anyway, try this pattern with me and you'll see for yourself how important timing is to our watercolor practice. Okay, for our next pattern, we're going to basically build a pattern using the wet on dry technique, and I want to test out this flat wash brush. Yes, I used it for those tiny splotches, but a wash brush is great for laying down a nice, smooth, even area of color. And I've got a nice watery dark blue here. And we are going to pick up the pigment in our brush and just run that brush across the page. You can go horizontally or vertically, it doesn't matter, but you see how much pigment I'm able to hold in the brush and just how beautifully it sort of flows onto the paper and I get a nice even wash. We would call this, what I've just done, a wash. And what I want to do now is let that dry since we're building a wet on dry pattern. But you know what? I'm very impatient, so I'm going to grab a little bit of black pigment on this flat wash brush. We'll stick with the same brush, and while that blue wash is drying, I'm going to build another pattern, because why not? This is a kind of a fun way to use the wash brush. I get this very thin little line here, and I can just play and have fun and kind of just see what pattern I can create in the 5 minutes it's going to take for my wash to dry. Okay, I think my third pattern is complete, simple as it was. I'm going to flip back here. My wash is now dry, so I'm going to create a pattern using the wet on dry technique, and that just means that I've got a nice dry pigment here. My wash is dry, as I said. I'm taking some darker blue pigment in my number 4 round brush, and we're going to create a pattern, and I'm going to paint a bunch of little leaf designs. We're going to get more into floral painting in the next video. This is a 4-part video series, don't forget. But for now, just try painting some cute little leaves. Leaves are a lot of fun to paint. They're great brushwork practice. They're very hard to screw up. It's like, who can tell you that you painted a leaf wrong? They should look a little weird. They should look organic and a little wonky. And what I'm doing is just moving all around the nice square that I created with the wash and painting basically 2 leaf shapes, a smaller one with multiple leaves and a larger one with just 2 leaves. And in that way, using just 2 simple shapes, I've created a pretty leaf pattern. And because I did it using wet on dry, I was able to be very precise and do just exactly what I had planned. Next up, I need to try out this oval wash brush. It has a large belly and comes to a nice fine point, and I think it's going to be good for putting down a big old splotch of color here, the whole page. I want to get a nice wash, a messy wash, and I have a wonderfully watery pink mixed up on my palette. Remember, the more water you mix into your paints, the more transparent they will be. If you have a mop brush, you could also use that at this point. And then while that wash is wet, I am taking my smaller round brush. This is the number 4 round brush. And I'm mixing a little bit of this orange red and this peach and lots of white pigment together on the palette. And I've got a concentrated, a nice heavily pigmented dark peach color. And then I'm going to come over here and just lay down a whole bunch of spots or dots. I kind of move the brush in a circular way on the page to make a nice organic circle shape, basically. And you can see that that large area of color that I laid down, it was wetter in some spots and not so wet in others, frankly, quite dry in others. So I was able to play again with wet color into color, but also a little bit of wet on dry. And again, I'm kind of learning about timing. I'm starting to understand how long does it take for my wash to go from puddle wet to lightly wet to dry. Okay, so now what I need to do is let that one dry, and then I might add something else to it. I feel like that pattern could use a little something more. But in the meantime, I am liking these peachy hues. So I'm using this orange-red color, again, mixed with a little bit of white, but not too much white, just enough white to make it a little peachy, but I really want to keep that darkness. And then I'm taking my flat wash brush. You could also use the angle shader for this, anything with that nice flat bristle head. And we are just doing a grid. It's just a great way to practice your brush control and practice pressure. It's a simple pattern, but it is a nice practice. With that done, let's flip back and add something else to this one. I'm thinking a graphic black, and you can see I still had some little wet spots there. The dark peach is now a little bit wet, but I love that. That's the beauty of watercolor. You get those little happy accidents where there might be a wet area that you forgot about, and you get a tiny bit of blending, and it actually looks so beautiful. And you really can't always be totally in control with how things blend. So that's part of the beauty of watercolor that I really love, is the letting go of control. We can understand the brushes, we can understand the techniques, but at the end of the day, sometimes those fluid blends are going to do something that we didn't quite expect, and that is what is so wonderful about the watercolor medium. Continue to play and try some different patterns along with me. If you've got a mop brush or a wash brush, use those ones that you don't pick up quite as often. This is the time to try them out. If you want to, you can grab a little bit of washi tape and mask out a small section of the page. When we say mask, we just mean that we're protecting an area of the paper and the paint will not go there. So I've used washi tape here to give me a small bordered area. And now I am using the number 8 round brush, and I've got sort of a bluey green and some different blues mixed up. And I'm doing kind of a water pattern. I'm experimenting with adding different amounts of pressure to my brush. I'm using the belly of the brush versus the tip of the brush. And I'm creating a stripe pattern that I want to look like water. You'll notice I've also put some little blooms in there. This is the perfect time to utilize them. Remember, you're wet into wet, and try some more wet on dry if you like. With this one, really anything goes. As you work through these patterns, you're also going to think about design. Think about making patterns that are pleasing to the eye. This is sort of a gut feeling sort of thing, but this first pattern that we did, when I looked at it and it was all done, I thought that needs a little something more. So I thought, well, these are sort of large circles. Why don't I try adding something to it that's a little bit smaller, a little finer? So I'm taking a dark concentrated yellow ochre here, and I'm adding some smaller circles. And then I grabbed some cobalt blue just on my number 4 round brush, and I thought I'll add some thin, tiny lines. So adding some smaller, finer details will just help me sort of finish this one up and bring it to a place where I'm really happy with it. Okay, and that's it. That's my last pattern complete. This little guy, I just need to remove the tape, and you can see we have this beautiful masked out clean white border. It's very satisfying. And here's what we did in today's video. We worked through some watercolor techniques together, 6 techniques that will set you up for success. And then we tried all our different brushes and we implemented those techniques as we painted patterns. Your patterns might look like mine, but I hope you've also created a few, or you plan to create a few, that are totally your own creation. Any color, any brush, any technique, you can play and have fun. I really encourage you to paint like you're a kid again. This is the best way to learn, is to free yourself of the stress of trying to paint something good. Just have fun with the materials and the techniques. And that's it for our second lesson. I hope you're feeling a little more comfortable with your watercolor techniques and that you're not afraid of those weirder brushes in the brush jar. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to look out for video 3 where we're going to talk about watercolor flowers.